Lisa, you're here.
CC.
It's so good to hear you.
I'm sorry, Francisco. We're actually eating dinner, so we don't want to turn our video on.
No, that's okay. I saw the ceiling. Hi, Kim.
Francisco, how are you? Nice to see you.
So good to hear you. Thank you for coming. That's so sweet.
We wouldn't miss
We
it.
wouldn't miss it.
Oh, thank you.
But we do miss you.
Yeah.
I miss you guys too. I was talking to Dot earlier today.
Oh, wow.
Oh, that's nice.
Remembering dinner at your place.
Oh, yes. So good that Kurt got his procedure done. Wow.
He got it 2 Fridays ago, and his recovery, thankfully, has been super smooth.
Great. Perfect.
But
please say hello and give him our regards.
I will.
He's lucky too, because they've stopped lots of operations now.
Yeah.
Again.
They were trying to get him in before anything would happen, and it was exactly a week before we went back to stage 2.
Right.
Wow. Perfect.
Amazing timing.
Yeah. He went for a walk, and then he's gonna join the feed. So.
Oh, good.
He hears me talk enough.
Yeah. Exactly.
How's V-tape?
V-tape is actually okay.
Yeah.
With so many people teaching online.
Oh, amazing.
They need all the resources they can get, right? So it's kept us very busy.
Oh, I'm so glad. Say hi to everybody there, please.
We will.
I mean, most of the people are working remotely, of course, like Wanda and Deirdre and Dustin and Kira and Lisa.
Yeah.
So just Chris and I are the only people that go in.
In the place. Say hi at the next Zoom.
Yeah, Thursdays, tomorrow.
But we have regular programming. The curatorial incubator's on right now, and it's quite good.
I saw the live that Adam Barbeau did with John. I saw the one that Yania did with Andrea.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah, that was amazing. That one.
Yeah. So yeah.
And there's another one this Friday.
Yeah, there's this one starting this Friday, and starting with Erica DeFreitas's piece.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, what's going on?
Great.
Yeah.
How's your teaching going?
It's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot, but I sort of it's a really intense sort of like 3.5 days, and then I keep the end of the week for studio.
Good.
That sort of keeps me a little bit sane.
Yeah.
Guess what we're doing now?
Tell me.
Supervising a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old as they do schooling from home.
Well, all those years supervising all of us,
it's so much harder.
Yeah, you guys at least stayed seated. It's like so hard to keep them sitting down. They roar around the room. And
oh my God.
It's really quite
the teachers are working so hard, you can just see it. You can just see them like exhaustion at the end of the day.
I'm glad I'm teaching adults. I'll say that.
Yes. But both of their teachers are wonderful, and Emmett is 7 and he's in French immersion, and it's going really well. And he was kind of mad at the beginning because he had just been playing
6 months of playing,
and he thought that was really great, but they didn't. Then he starts the school thing. And he's a little mad, and now he really likes it because he loves to learn. He just
so sweet.
Yeah.
So are we waiting for a few people?
I think Randa's.
We should probably.
Yes, we're just waiting till 7:10, so 1 minute, and then we'll start.
Perfect.
Great.
Perfect.
We'll stop yapping.
And this is a GALSU event?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's joint between GALTU, AFSU, and FGSA.
Perfect.
Oh, nice.
That's really great. Really great.
Yeah, it's been really fun. We're trying to get a speaker who graduated from each of the Daniels programs to get kind of a wide range of paths and experiences.
That's a very smart idea.
Really smart idea. Well done.
Thank you.
We'll tune in for the future ones too.
Thank you.
Isn't it funny now? Like you can get all booked up with Zoom things now. It's like, oh, I'm busy that night, or it's like, what?
I know.
We're at home.
Yeah, there's a workshop for everything.
Yeah.
Exactly.
For some reason, there's about 10 things tomorrow.
Yeah.
I'm in a seminar through EGS with Gayatri Spivak Thursday to Saturday.
Wow.
Oh, wow. Wonderful.
Gee.
A lot of reading, but great.
I bet. Well, that's she is your mentor. So you have
That's terrific.
it's wonderful. Enjoy.
Thank you. I'm excited, actually.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to read now.
Shall we start?
Anytime.
Thank you. First, hi everyone, welcome. I'd just like to start with a land acknowledgement. So I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Daniels honors Indigenous peoples past, present, and future here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. So yeah, again, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you to Francisco-Fernando Granados for being here. We're very excited. So Francisco-Fernando Granados is a Toronto-based artist and writer. His practice extends from performance and drawing into a range of media that includes site-specific installation, moving image, text, public and participatory projects. He draws from refugee and queer experiences by using conceptual approaches and abstraction as strategies to structure the work. These strategies challenge perceptions regarding the stability of identity categories while searching for moments of agency within narratives of struggle. Through these moments, the work seeks to articulate configurations of desire rather than expressions of need. He has presented work in galleries, museums, theaters, artist-run centers, and non-traditional sites since 2005. These venues include the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Mercer Union, Art Gallery of York University, Gallery TPW, Trinity Square Video, Images Festival, Nuit Blanche, and many, many, many more. Awards and honors are also very many, including the Emerging Artist Grants from the Toronto and Ontario Arts Councils, a Projects to Visual Artist Grant from the Canada Council for the Arts, and the Governor General Silver Medal for Academic Achievement upon graduating from Emily Carr University in 2010. So we've invited Francisco-Fernando Granados today as he completed his Master's of Visual Studies at the University of Toronto in 2012, and he currently works as an assistant professor in the Faculty of Art at OCAD University. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you to you and Nini and everybody I've been working with in the Student Union for making tonight happen. And thank you to Dana Prieto, who I know was the person who recommended me. So thank you so much. It seems like what we'll do is I'll present a couple of projects and talk a little bit about my experience through MVS. And then Randa and I will have a conversation, and then people might have a chance to ask some questions. As Randa's really kind introduction stated, I'm an artist. I'm a Toronto-based artist because studying at MVS brought me to Toronto. And the experience of going through MVS created for me such a wonderful community and such wonderful context for my practice to exist that upon finishing MVS, I really grew roots in the city. And that's the reason I'm a Toronto-based artist, because in many, many, many ways, MVS was the beginning of me being able to create a home here, and I had the chance to work with really, really wonderful artists who I had read about and whose work I knew, who all of a sudden were my advisors, so particularly Lisa and Kim, Tanya Mars, Will Kwan, Ed Pien, so I'm really, really super honored, and I hope to be able to, in this talk, talk a little bit about the work that I did through there. I came to Canada as a refugee in 2001. I got my family and I got our refugee claimant status on March 17 of 2004. And the first thing I did after we got the notice that we had been accepted as refugees was I went back home and I went on the computer and I sought information on the fine arts program at the local community college in Vancouver called Langara. And I decided to request a package of information, and that's what sort of started my path in being educated in art. So in terms of introducing my practice, I just want to say that for me, even perhaps unconsciously, the first choice that I made the moment I knew that I would be able to stay in this country and eventually become a citizen, the first choice I made was to become an artist. I'll share this work, which is a work that I did prior to coming to MVS. It was, in fact, the very last performance that I did in my undergrad. And as a professor at Emily Carr, I now teach undergraduates. And one of the things that I now know about what that process of being an undergrad was for me was that I actually really just walked out of my undergrad with one single work that really was able to transcend all the studying and the years that I took, taking fine arts at Langara College, and then going on to Emily Carr to finish my undergraduate. And it's this work called Spatial Profiling. Spatial Profiling is a performance that I've done from 2009 all the way to 2017, and is a performance that has a very, very simple idea behind it. A body, often mine, presses themselves against the wall and slowly traces the outline of their face as they move in the space. For as long as they can, for as long as the wall will go, there are different kinds of circumstances and contexts in which this work has happened. And it was a work that happened almost by happenstance while I was still an undergraduate. I was in my studio and I was doing these performances where I would press myself up against the walls of the architecture. And I saw a Sharpie out of the corner of my eyes. And since I was hanging out there and the Sharpie was sort of within reach, I decided to grab the Sharpie and I started drawing. And then I moved a little bit. And then I started drawing again. And then I moved a little bit until after doing it for about 20 minutes, I realized that something had probably happened. And when I disengaged, this mark, this horizontal mark that was more abstract than not, had really emerged. One of the things, this is a performance that started before my undergraduate, but partly because of the ways in which I was able to take a break from it and really attune my senses and attune my practice, I was able to actually come back to it and revisit it after I finished my master's degree. So it's something that I sort of picked up and that has sort of had a life on its own afterwards. It has been performed here in Toronto as part of the Mayworks Festival of Working People. It has been performed in Helsinki. It has been performed at the Bard College in New York. And this is a photograph from that installation next to a Felix Gonzalez Torres, I should add. And it's a work that for me really embodies the importance in my practice of the idea of aesthetic education. The idea of, as somebody who came as a refugee to this country, having the possibility of, becoming something else, which I sort of see in relationship to the way in which the body, which is the sort of vertical figurative thing, in the wake of its movement, leaves a trace that is sort of horizontal and abstract. In engaging, one of the really important things that working in MVS allowed me to do, because of working with Lisa, because of working with Tanya, was to really focus on performance and to really be able to think about performance art as a serious medium, which was something that I didn't necessarily feel was available to me in the educational options that I would have had back in Vancouver at the time. And so a lot of my experimentation in my first year of visual studies at U of T had to do with ideas around identity, ideas around having become a refugee, having become a citizen, and reconciling that process perhaps through different ways of embodiment. The image that I'm showing right now is the interim federal health, which is a form of identification that gets given to refugee claimants when they enter the country, and it grants them healthcare. But it also, as you can see in the note that is sort of outlined, handwritten underneath the text, it also granted me, at the time, the authorization to go to school for a year. And so from being in a place where education, certainly post-secondary education, wasn't even really a guarantee, I took the work that I did at MVS as a chance to not just meditate on performativity and not just meditate on visual art, but more broadly meditate on ideas around belonging, ideas around how you come to identify with a group of people. The image that I'm showing right now is an image from a chat roulette interaction that I had with a stranger in 2010. And if some people might not know chat roulette, some people might know chat roulette. Chat roulette was a randomized webcam website that you joined. And so upon seeing my face, this person, called me the names that are in the text. And even though when I had this exchange, it was really, really intuitive and I wasn't really thinking about what I was doing, I thought of screenshotting it. And when I look back on it, I realized that part of what I had done in this exchange, rather than either confirming or denying this person's stereotypes or judgments about myself by the way I looked on camera to them, was to refuse the identification. Was to neither confirm nor deny, was to turn the question back onto them. And these intuitions of exploring my identity as a refugee, but also refusing certain kinds of identification that can be brutalizing to somebody, were the basis of the project that I did as my master's thesis. It was a project called Apostrophe, and it was called Apostrophe because an apostrophe marks an absence, but apostrophes also, in a more literary sense, an apostrophe is a speech that a character gives where they turn away from everybody else in the scene and approach either an abstraction or they approach the audience. Apostrophe was a performance installation that happened at UTAC as part of the MVS graduating show, in which I attempted, as Lisa actually really beautifully articulated in her notes for the catalog that year, where I tried to articulate an impossible conversation with the spirit of Omar Khadr. Omar Khadr, as I think we all know, is a fellow Canadian citizen who was captured in Afghanistan in 2002 and who was jailed extrajudicially in Guantanamo. And at the time of making this performance, he was still in Guantanamo and he was in fact being judged in an illegal panel that eventually convicted him for murder. Before moving to Toronto, I had actually picked up this postcard that you see here at an event in support of his case. And it was a postcard by Amnesty International that asked the Prime Minister at the time, who was Stephen Harper, to ask for Cotter back. And something that, of course, didn't happen. And so I took the postcard and I never sent it, but I also never actually got rid of it. There was something about that postcard that really tugged at my heart and that really wouldn't leave my mind. At first, I thought that it might have been the fact that if you turn the postcard around, which is something that I don't show, you actually see a photo of Cotter. And there was maybe something at the beginning where his eyes reminded me of my brother's eyes, because my brother also has sort of deep brown eyes. But there was something I couldn't articulate that really made me think about this case and made me think about this object. In the midst of my research, after my first year of research at MVS, and doing a lot of experiments and really thinking about my practice and thinking about all these lines of inquiry that I had started in the program, I realized that the only artwork that I could possibly make in the context of MVS, in the context of being a student, was a work that engaged with a conversation with Cotter. Or, as I was to find out through the process of making this performance and this installation, the impossibility of a conversation with Cotter. Working with theorists like John Paul Rico, who I got a chance to take a couple of classes with, both in art history and as part of comparative literature, I was able to really throw myself for a spin and really challenge myself to learn to read philosophy, which was something I hadn't had a chance to do, and to really learn to read theory. And I think through those studies, I was able to see, and through the reflection that came through those studies, reading people like Roland Barthes, reading people like Jean-Luc Nancy, and beginning a long-term intellectual engagement with Gayatri Spivak, who's a really important thinker for me, I realized that approaching this project of a correspondence with Cotter through identification was actually not the way to go about it. I realized that, and one of the things that I started to think about was the fact that he had left Canada soon before I had come to Canada. You know, he was fighting in a field as I was a student here in Canada. You know, by the time that I was a convention refugee, he was already in Guantanamo. And so I realized that my trajectory in relationship to his was not actually a parallel trajectory, but it was a trajectory that was almost in the opposite direction. And so I did quite a bit of research on his case. I actually, in fact, assumed that people would, that to make this performance would be completely redundant, because people would assume that what had happened to him was an injustice. But I soon found out that that wasn't necessarily the case. And so I began to do research process where, rather than trying to identify with him, or rather to try to use his image or even his name, I began to erase documents that had his name. I began to erase images of him, not as a way to erase him, but as a way to create a sense of opacity, you know, create a space where his image couldn't be objectified, and also as a way to make space for, in the best of hopes, for him to be able to speak one day. The performance that I did in the end ended up taking the 3 middle rooms in the space at UTAC, and there were 3 actions in sort of in meditation of his situation, and in meditation of the difference between our situations. And the thing that really connected us, I think, even though at the beginning I was really thinking about him in relationship to this idea of a fellow citizen, and then I thought about it in relationship to my brother's eyes, I actually felt like in the end, the thing that we could relate through was the idea of being students, as he was also in his jail cell in Guantanamo being educated. And I tried to think about the irreconcilable differences between his education and my education. I was a TA in Scarborough at the time, TAing for Tanya, and I knew that he was from Scarborough. And I couldn't help but think that if things had been otherwise, he might have actually been going to UTSC, and we might have actually crossed and never known each other. So in meditation of all of these thoughts, I created 3 actions. I created an action that you see here on the right, in which I used the apostrophe mark as a way to mark the number of days that he had been held in Guantanamo. And to the date of the show, of the opening of the show, when I did the performance at UTAC, it had been 3,463 days. So I somehow, and I have to thank Lisa and Carmen Victor, who was working there at the time, I got permission to graffiti the walls of UTAC by, imprinting more than 4,000 apostrophes on the wall. Then on the far left corner, I did an action in which I went into Romeo and Juliet, which was one of the texts that he had been reported to be reading in prison. And so I went into the text, and anywhere where Romeo spoke, which was the part that Omar Khadr was supposed to be reading in jail, I made a blank of the name, and I made a blank of whatever he would say. Again, as a way of creating a kind of conceptual space in which he would one day speak. In the end, within the project, within the performance, I not only didn't use his image, but I also didn't use his name. So people wandering into the installation would have had to actually read the essay in order to know what it was about. But it was important for me not to claim him as a sign, but to actually attempt a more complex way of approaching him. After he was repatriated to Canada, and as he's been able to actually sort of come back into some kind of subjective framework, I've decided, I talk about it by actually saying who it's about and everything, because the circumstance has changed. But at the time, within the performance, there was nowhere you could see who this was about. You had to feel it. I think we're sort of coming up on the 20 minutes. So maybe rather than talking about another thing, I'll wrap up this part of it by saying that this was a piece that I could have only made at MVS. It was a piece that I could have only made in Toronto, and it was a piece that I could have only really made by going to MVS and finding my way, not just downtown, but in Scarborough, and having all of these echoes of this idea that I had reverberate in my heart in a certain way, but also to be able to work through them in my mind in such a way that I was able to make that piece. It was a very hard piece to make. I had the fortune of having some incredibly generous and tough advising and conversations with my panel. I would cry, and I would sometimes not know who I thought I was in order to make this piece. And actually, one of the things that I did with my writing for the degree was to, rather than writing something that was much more sort of straightforwardly academic, if you read my MVS paper, it's actually, I'm exploring the question of whether and how I can do that piece. And I don't think it's a work that would have happened absolutely anywhere else. So, there's many ways in which it has influenced my work. It in some ways also was the sort of a certain, it wrapped up a chapter in my practice in which I was using my body much more. And a lot of the work that I do now actually deals much more with abstraction and ideas around making abstraction site-specific and making abstraction ephemeral. And, these things that I learned about what you cannot claim but you have to feel are things that now look a lot different in my work than they did when I was a student at MVS. But this work, Apostrophe, in the context of MBS was absolutely the thing that, the absolute condition of possibility for everything that's sort of happened in my practice afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was great. I've been able to see your work online, but it's really interesting to actually hear you talk about it and present it. I was thinking maybe now we could, well, I would be asking some questions and hopefully you would be answering them.
Happy to.
Thank you. When I guess you were speaking about kind of the importance of MBS in your, not only your career, but your practice, and it sounds like a very like personal experience. And I was wondering, do you think that it's because the MBS kind of provided a structure for you to engage with this work, or is it somehow, you know, to some extent circumstantial, where if you had been in another city, you would have taken on a different project?
I think it's absolutely contingent on me being in Toronto and being in MVS, in the sense that, you know, the program, I think, I think now that the program might look a little bit different, because that was before we fully integrated into Daniels. But at the time, certainly, it had a really excellent combination of a lot of independent time and to research and to pursue your own studio practice, and the broadest possible choice, certainly in Canada, of courses that were parallel or intersecting to your interests, that were able to, that could really nourish and challenge your mind, so that, at least in my case, I could really refine my thinking, and in some ways reshape my thinking, and in other ways confirm my thinking about my work. You know, really briefly, if I tell, you know, the having the support of the core MVS faculty and having all of that freedom, but also being able to take classes. You know, I took a transnational feminism class with Ashwini Tambe, who I think now is in Maryland. I took 2 classes with John, you know, and John Paul Rico, whose approach to queer theory has deeply shaped me. So, you know, if I had gone somewhere else, I would have hoped to have made a work that was just as interesting or you know, valuable to my practice. But yeah, there was actually something deeply personal that drew me to the program, and the way in which it formed community for me, also outside. You know, there was a queer of color working group at the time that Ricky Varghese, who's an art writer and fellow right now at Ryerson, but at the time he was a PhD student. You know, he met me through a friend and brought me to this reading group that U of T was hosting on queerness, race, and theory. And so I was able to really complement my learning. I was also, and Lisa can tell you this, I was also very good about asking for what I needed. If I needed something, I would, you know, if I knew of an artist who I really thought I should have a conversation with, I would ask if they knew, if people knew, if there was something that they were doing, you know, and I would go see their talks, or, you know, so I was actually quite proactive, and I was excited. I was enthusiastic about the program.
Yeah, I'm personally an architecture student, so I know that with us there's always, you know, the 2 paths or 3 paths, and one is working in a firm under other people, and one is the slightly more brave one, of like going out there and starting from scratch. But I'm assuming that in art, however broad that the field is, I guess every artist is to some extent more independent, so it sounds like there has to be that proactiveness. Right? I guess I wonder, how did you go about kind of getting, like, building your network, but also getting your work out there and reaching out to galleries and such?
I think rather than thinking about it as the building of a network, the way that I've always approached it has been, on one hand, on building community and communities. You know, like, I began to volunteer with the 7A11D Performance Art Festival, which was a collective that I eventually became a part of. Through this Queer of Color working group, I met people who I could have conversations that were really essential to me. But I've always looked at it as building community and building the conversations, building discussions, because especially when you're starting out, there's so many possibilities that open up to you that it's good to, on one hand, have options and to really remain open. And then if you're able to be just a little bit patient, usually the path that makes the most sense to you tends to hint itself. So yeah, forming this community through performance art, through the performance art collective, building different kinds of ongoing dialogues with people that sometimes didn't lead to collaborations, until years down the line. But being able to remain a part of it and remain connected.
I was also really interested in what you were saying about how with the project that you were working on during your MBS, people wouldn't know necessarily who you were talking about until they read the paper. And I was wondering, in your writing, is your writing usually kind of documenting your artwork, or does it depend on the time? Is it sometimes like an art piece in itself? Is it just you engaging with topics that you've been thinking about?
I began to write and publish my writing out of a kind of need, because there were certain things that I felt needed to be talked about that weren't being talked about, particularly early in my practice as it related to refugee experience and visibility within a contemporary art framework. That has changed a lot. There are dialogues on race and ethnicity and culture and refugee and migrant experiences. There didn't feel to me like there were enough of those dialogues when I was an undergraduate. And so I began to write because I wasn't hearing the points that I wanted to make. And so I thought, okay, English is not my first language, so writing is work. I think, for a very, very, very long time, I think writing was a way for me to actually parallel from my practice, not so much writing about my work, but writing parallel to my practice, to think about this position of going from refugee to citizen, and actually where the writing led me and where that critical line of thinking led me was to notions of settler accountability, to notions of, not everybody that came to Canada at the same time my family did, or around the time my family did, got to stay, and I got to stay. So to really use my position as a citizen, to exercise the right that I have as a citizen to be self-critical, to be constructively self-critical of the body politic I belong to, which is Canada, and to hold it up, to think about holding our end up of the nation-to-nation dialogue. That's, in terms of my critical writing per se, that's sort of where the writing took me. It took me to a political position that I hold quite strongly. Once I sort of finished that arc and made that point, that essay was actually published in Other Places, which is a collection of essays edited by Diana Bowen, who's also a graduate, last year. I wrote that about 5 years ago, and at that point it felt like the thing that I had started wanting to say more than 10 years ago, I had managed to say it. And I think since then, and it was actually around then that I was able to turn back to abstraction, and I was able to turn back to my more formal training in drawing and writing. I can feel writing coming back up for me, but not in an academic way, but actually more as fiction or short fiction or experimental fiction.
And I guess speaking of writing, can you tell us a bit more about your decision to also go into teaching? Was that a way of kind of furthering the writing process or something else?
Not even 3 months after I finished MVS, I was invited to take part in an indigenous, non-indigenous performant art exchange that happened in Peterborough through an organization called Odeminguises, which was an indigenous festival in the city. And that exchange and being able to do workshops under Rebecca Velmore, under Lori Blondo, under Guillermo Gomez Peña, and the experience of, as soon as I came back, actually, I knew that there was, I had heard of Alaniso Bomsawin because when I was a young person making film and video, not as an artist, but just as community programming for immigrants and refugees, I'd gotten a chance to meet Alaniso Bomsawin. And I knew that one of her films was being screened at TIFF. And so after this indigenous, non-indigenous performance exchange, I went straight from the bus shelter to watch what I didn't know was Kanasatake, 270 Years of Resistance. And I wasn't here for the Oka crisis. I was still sort of gaining my language around ideas of responsible citizenship, particularly in Canada. And watching that film actually broke me in two. And afterwards, I asked Alaniso Bomsawin why she had made the films. And one of the things that I felt while watching the films was that these films needed to be taught. I wouldn't have put it in these words back then, but I felt really strongly that work like this needed to be in curriculum. And so I asked her what I didn't just make a kind of emotional settler display. I actually asked her a question. And the question was, what do you think is the educational roles of these films? And she said, I made them so that they would be taught. And there was something other than the fact that I needed jobs and there were things that I could apply, and I applied for about 6 months mostly to OCAD, and I got rejected until I finally got an interview. But, so on a practical level, teaching was about needing some kind of work that I was qualified for and opportunities. At a more intellectual and philosophical level, it was in many ways rooted by that answer by Alaniso Bomsawin, by her saying these films need to be taught. And in fact, one of the first classes I taught at OCAD, a first-year course, we looked at that film. That film was sort of the center of the course.
I really appreciate that it sounds like you do a lot of things based on instinct and gut feeling, which is great. Last question I personally have for opening it to the floor. I was wondering if you had any advice for students graduating from Daniels or other who are worried about working and finding work, especially kind of pandemic time and not knowing if there's work out there.
I mean, I think it's I think it's actually hard for somebody who came out under very different sets of circumstances to really give advice and for it not to feel kind of top down. But I know that there are certain things that really helped me in the period right after finishing. I think retaining a connection to the places that I came from became really important, whether that was my Guatemalan family back in New Westminster, British Columbia, whether that was the performance art community that I came from back in Vancouver, whether that was particular people who taught me in undergrad who became friends, whether it was the community that I made through MVS. One of the really interesting things that happened, and this was really the kind of really lucky thing that makes me feel like I can't give serious advice, was that in the 3 years following me coming to MVS, 3 classmates, colleagues, and friends of mine who had also graduated from Emily Carr actually also applied to MVS and were accepted into MVS. So the year following me starting at MVS, Manolo Lugo it was accepted. Then the following year, Golbu Amani was accepted. And then the following year, Roya Akbari came into MVS. So this community of like-minded people and down the road family that I had began to grow there slowly migrated over to Toronto, and we were able to be sort of housed by the program for these 4 wonderful years, where even after I finished, I was still in the studios all the time. So I think community and a sense of rootedness is important wherever that might come. I think, you know, one of the best pieces of advice that Tanya Mars gave me one day while giving me a ride back from the TAing was, she turned to me and she said, as I was about to graduate, eventually you're going to have to get a job. And no lie, you know, teaching is my job, and teaching is what, you know, it does quite a number of things for me intellectually and philosophically, but it is also, you know, I make my living by teaching people. And so honoring that job, you know, and then remaining rooted and flexible enough that you can still work on, especially if you're an artist. You know, because I think in architecture, it's actually quite different. My partner, Kurt Krahler, is an architect, and you know, I know that things work quite differently on that side. But having the flexibility and having the support to be able to, in whatever pace, pursue your work. I don't think you have to get too worried about immediate markers of success. I don't think you have to get too worried about, you know, things that are much more business-like as an artist. Even though I know this might sound a little bit out of touch, ultimately, you are happier as an artist if you find the context in which your work can be nurtured and challenged kindly and productively than you do if you just enter a kind of contemporary art rat race that could be about anything. Hopefully that's decent.
Yes, that was great. Thank you. Would anyone in the audience like to ask a question, make a comment, jump in? You can also leave it in the chat and I can read it. And if not, I always have more questions.
I think we have a bit of no.
A hen? Oh, you were saying we have a bit more time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll flip through more drawings in the meantime.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about these, since you.
Yes. I mean, these mark a little bit of a sharp turn in my practice. In 2016, my life changed quite a bit, and I found that many of the ways in which I had structured myself to work that were much more conceptual and much less intuitive, talk about intuition, were no longer working for me. I could no longer use them. And I found that, at least for that time period where I felt like everything was hard, reading was hard, writing was hard. This is also about the time when I had sort of wrapped up this idea of what I wanted to find out with the writing, you know, and then writing became really, really, really hard, and reading became quite hard. And I found that the only thing that I really could do at the time, something that was a training that I'd had that was that felt natural. I think nature is a concept that we need to be critical of, was drawing, and was non-objective drawing, was abstract compositions. And much to my surprise, I began engaging with it in a very kind of almost everyday way through my phone. And about 3 months later, I seemed to be in the middle of a project of an artwork that I ended up calling Towards a Minor Abstraction. And so since then, I've really been working with ideas of minor abstraction as ways to take the compositional impulses of abstraction that we might know through art history, but rather than creating works that make transcendental claims or that seek to have a kind of sense of permanence and weight, to try to see just how flexible and how context specific and how site specific they can become, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think Lisa has a question. Would you like me to read it, or would you like to jump in?
I'll just ask it. I've always wondered how the studio visit with Tanya Bergaria went. I brought her to the door with her suitcase. She was on her way out of town, and we managed to, you wanted to see her and you knew she was in town, and somehow we got her there.
Can I quickly tell that anecdote?
Yeah.
You know, so Tanya Bruguera, and this is part of what I was talking about, asking for what you needed. This was actually before Tanya Bruguera was the kind of art star that she is, and before she was really kind of in the currency. And through a poster at UTSC campus, I knew that she was doing a talk as part of the Latin American Speakers series. And so I don't even know how I managed to be this bold, but I think I sort of walked into Lisa's office and I said, is there any way we can bring Tanya Bruguera to the pro seminar or something? And I think Lisa said, let me call her and see if she'll do something. And I guess, Lisa, you called her and she said yes. And so on her last day after her talk, I managed to do a studio visit in One Spadina Crescent. You know, it was a really great studio visit because she was brutally honest. You know, she even though in her own practice she doesn't really say she cares for sharpness or the sort of quite aesthetic concerns, she gave me almost formalist critiques on some of my performance photographs that I had. But she also talked about the fact that the most powerful thing in my work at the time was this idea of presence and being present. And she also commented on the idea of the use of language. You know, so it was good. It was good because it was challenging, and in some way, especially at the time, you know, it was MVS bringing somebody who wasn't necessarily in the kind of art school curriculum parlance as much as she would be now. MVS was able to reach out and sort of bring her for me, and it was a really important conversation, mostly because I've come to disagree with some of her positions, you know, and I think she would disagree with some of mine. But it was an excellent exchange. Also, you know, Mika Ball, having a chance to talk to Mika Ball was amazing. And then I have to, if it's time for us to go soon, I really would like to say this closer to the end. Life-changing studio visits with Michael Fernandez, who in the middle of our studio visit, there was some kind of birds flying by or something, and he just went, listen. And then the studio visit that ultimately gave me the courage to make this work about Cotter, which was one of the most fantastic hours I've had in the studio with another artist, with Lani Maestro.
Oh wow.
Interesting.
Changed my life. That hour with Lani Maestro. You know, I don't know that I would have had the courage to make that Cotter piece. And she got me, right? Because she's a Filipina Canadian. She fled her country, you know, and she just said, listen to your heart.
Nice. Beautiful. Thank
you for that question.
You were fun.
I tried to be fun. I had fun.
And you were really challenging because you always just kept pushing. It was great.
Yeah.
You were great to have. And thanks to Galsu and Su and MVS and everybody for bringing you here. And please keep us on the list to we'll keep looking at the Daniels site, because even though we're retired, we're still there. Our hearts are there.
Thank you, guys.
We'll definitely keep you up to date.
Francisco, where are you?
Yeah.
I'm in my studio, which is the sunroom in my place.
Oh, okay.
I've got a heater over here, and then Kurt's in the bedroom probably watching.
Great. Let's do a Zoom soon.
Yes, please.
Last call for questions. Wait a couple seconds.
It's hard to ask questions on these things.
Well, Francisco, you entered the MVS program with your project called the tracing project called
Spatial profiling.
Yeah,
profiling.
right.
Can you like unpack the profiling concept for us?
It absolutely. It really happened. It really just happened to me in the sense that I was experimenting in the studio and I did it. And it took me a really long time it took me, in fact, almost years to understand what the piece meant. And it was actually by being able to come back to it and continue working on it that I really understood what it was about. At the very beginning of me making that piece, and for as long as I performed it with my body, that work was really about transformation. And I think about what it means to go from figure to landscape, what it means to go from, a recognizable human being to a sort of sea of horizontal marks. As I sort of went through the process, as I got a little bit older, and as I got almost settled in a life where I knew I was no longer necessarily living the reality of a refugee out in my life, that the work actually transformed, and it became for me much more about decentering the body of the artist in the performance. And so I began to do variations on that piece where I would perform it before the show would open in the install, and then the show would open just with the drawing. I have done versions where there are 3 performers then switch, in between doing the action. And so it began as a way of thinking about transformation, and then it sort of ended up in a place where it's about how to think of performance, and perhaps how to think about art in general as a way to create a space in which others, anybody else, perhaps not everybody else, but potentially anybody else could step into.
For me, it's so interesting now that you've moved into the abstract works, which I love. They're so beautiful, and also you're exhibiting with giant artists. But to me, it's like, I don't want to move away from the political analysis of profiling, and it's the abstraction of it allows you to look at the idea of racial profiling in a much more interesting way, as not a kind of a black and white situation, but a complex situation.
And a little bit like I sort of say in the bio that started out the event, I think I'm interested in strategically destabilizing identity categories to the degree that these destabilizations can be liberatory. And so it similarly with the Cotter piece, I mean, Lisa, you asked me some incredibly essential, tough questions about my motives behind making a work about somebody who had been the object of so much violence, and you asked them very boldly, and I really had to grapple with those questions. And I think being able to find the answer in the complexities rather than in really monolithic ways of being became really, really important as a politics for me now.
Did you reach out to him when he was released?
Part of what I realized in the process of making that work.
I thought of you that the day he was released, you were the person I thought of.
I think this was the thing. And when I made the performance, it would have been so hard to think that he would have been ever released. One of the things I realized in terms of this idea of not just abstraction, but sort of like opacity, and the idea of using art as a way to think about the things you can't claim, was that the work in the end is ultimately about us. It's not about, he has, I think, more important things to do than this artwork. The performance is actually about us, all of us who were outside, who as citizens did not do something, or who might feel differently about it. So I decided that if we are to meet in some way, it has to be, it can't be something that you sort of build a kind of architecture about. And the other thing is, if I was ever to meet with him or talk to him, it's not something I would necessarily present within a work or even talk about.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, it becomes actually Tim Dean, one of the other theorists I had a chance to engage with during my years at MVS was Tim Dean through a conference that John Paul Rico
Mhm.
put together, and he talks about the idea of the obscenity or the obscene as that which is beyond what can be observed. And I think for me, it sort of enters that space.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Francisco-Fernando. This was a great time. The recording will be up on YouTube if anyone wants to rewatch. It'll be up forever probably. And yeah, we hope to have you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good night.